No one could say the exact hour when the child was born. Some swore it was just after dawn. Others whispered it was closer to midnight. What everyone remembered was not the time, but the sky. The clouds above the village did something unusual that day. They slowed. They seemed to hover, not with the weight of storm, but with the patience of someone waiting to listen. The air held its breath. Even the river nearby, always busy with its small chatter, seemed to hush itself. People would later describe the moment not as a birth, but as a pause, as though the world itself leaned back and gave space for something unexpected. A soft widening, a stretch. The kind of thing you don't notice until later, when you try to remember and realize the memory is brighter than it should be, tinted with a strange stillness. The child came quietly, without a cry, as if he already understood the hush around him. His mother held him close and hummed without thinking, the beginnings of a melody that would one day become a lullaby. She looked into his face, searching for something familiar, but saw instead a gentleness she could not place, like the calm after rain. The villagers who gathered outside the small house exchanged glances. It wasn't fear they felt, nor excitement. It was a kind of reverence. They could not explain it, only that the world seemed to have made room for this child, as if he were not born into the world, but the world into him. His father, a quiet man who rarely spoke beyond what was needed, touched the boy's small hand. To his surprise, the infant's fingers curled with unusual length, almost as if reaching not just for his father's hand, but for his heart. That reach lingered, and the father felt a sudden warmth. It was the first stretch, though no one yet understood what it meant. The days after his birth passed in soft wonder. His mother swore he seemed to take longer to blink, as if savoring the act of closing and opening his eyes. His grandmother, who had lived long enough to stop being surprised by most things, said she once saw him move an arm in such a way that it seemed to travel further than the arm itself. When she tried to describe it, she could only say, "He stretches," not just in body, but in presence. The villagers accepted this strangeness the way people accept certain flowers that only bloom at night or rivers that occasionally change their song. It became part of their sky, part of their daily rhythm. He was not a child to be explained, but one to be witnessed. At night, when he slept in the wooden cradle by the window, the sky above seemed to glow more softly. His mother, unable to rest, would hum to him, filling the room with a tune that had no words yet, but carried a feeling of safety, of belonging, of time moving gently. The boy's breathing fell into rhythm with her song, and for the first time since his arrival, she slept soundly. There was a quiet magic in those early years. The boy's laughter came not often, but when it did, it lingered in the air longer than ordinary sound, as though the moment stretched itself to keep the joy alive. His family noticed that when he reached for a toy, the toy seemed already halfway into his hand before he touched it. When he fell, he did not fall quickly, but with a strange slowness, like a feather negotiating the air. No one hurried to label these things. In that place and time, names mattered less than feelings, and the feeling around the boy was one of gentle awe. Children played with him as though nothing was unusual. Adults watched with cautious wonder but spoke little, fearing words might break whatever delicate thread the boy was tied to. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the clouds began their slow drift again, the boy's father carried him out to the meadow. The air smelled of grass and faint wood smoke. He set the child down in the tall green blades, and for the first time the boy reached both arms toward the horizon. He did not move far, just stretched, as though his small body wanted to hold the setting sun itself. His father laughed softly, then grew quiet, realizing the gesture was not play but something else, something the boy would grow into. The village would not speak of destiny. They did not believe in grand prophecies, but they began to notice that when the boy was near, their own moments felt different. Meals lasted a little longer. Laughter echoed a little more sweetly. Even silence seemed to rest more comfortably. It was as though he stretched not just his own time, but everyone's. And yet in all of this, the boy remained ordinary too. He cried when he was hungry, fussed when he was tired, clung to his mother's shoulder in thunderstorms. His strangeness was woven into his normalcy, inseparable like threads in a single cloth. Perhaps that is why the village never feared him. He was human first, and something else only after. As the seasons passed, the sky continued to slow for him. Winters seemed longer but gentler. Summers shimmered as if held in suspension. The boy grew beneath this softened world, and though he did not yet know it, the world was teaching him how to stretch, how to hold, how to linger. The villagers began to hum his mother's tune when they worked in the fields. No one remembered where it came from, only that it felt like it had always been there, as if carried on the boy's breath. The lullaby became a quiet motif in their days, a reminder that life could move more slowly, more tenderly. The boy himself never knew the exact day of his birth, nor did he need to. He would grow up hearing the story of the sky that slowed, and though he smiled at it, he never asked for more detail. Some things he seemed to understand are not meant to be explained. They are only meant to be felt, and so his beginning became a kind of whisper in the village, not a proclamation but a gentle presence that drifted through memory. People would say, "Do you remember when he was born how the clouds moved differently?" And another would nod, "Yes, I remember." It was as though time itself took a breath. No one could ever quite agree what it meant. But they all agreed on one thing. The boy had not come into the world as ordinary children do. He had arrived like a pause in the song of life, a hush that lingered, a stretch that would one day reach further than any of them could imagine. And in that hush, the story begins. He was still small when it first happened, so small that the world around him seemed impossibly large. Tables were mountains, chairs were cliffs, and his brother's hand was a bridge across vastness. In those years, his days were filled with ordinary discoveries: the taste of warm bread, the texture of river stones, the sound of footsteps echoing in a hallway at dusk. Yet within that ordinariness, something unusual began to unfold. It started simply with a reach. His mother placed a wooden cup on the table, just beyond the usual length of his arm. The boy stretched toward it, and the room seemed to hold its breath. His fingers extended farther than they should have, brushing the rim of the cup. He did not notice anything strange, he was only reaching, but his mother froze. She saw how his arm lengthened, almost imperceptibly, like a ribbon unraveling. The boy laughed when his hand closed around the cup. To him it was a small triumph, nothing more. But to his parents, it was the first confirmation that the child carried a gift, or perhaps a burden, though they never called it that aloud. They exchanged a glance across the table, a quiet agreement to treat it not as a curse or miracle, but as simply him. As days passed, his reach grew not only in body, but in something harder to name. Once, while playing with his older brother, he stretched across the grass to grab a stick, and his laughter seemed to pull the moment longer too. His brother noticed that the game didn't end as quickly as usual, as though time itself had stretched along with the boy's arm. The family did not rush to explain. Instead, they adapted in small ways. His father would place things just a little farther than before, encouraging him. His mother sang lullabies that lingered with pauses between notes, teaching him to hold space with sound as much as with reach. His brother teased him gently, calling him the boy with the long hands, but behind the words was a kind of awe. There was never fear in their household, only quiet wonder. The family understood that what made him different was not danger but tenderness. His stretches did not grasp or take forcefully. They reached softly, like someone offering a hand to a stranger. One evening his brother fell while climbing the small hill behind their home. The tumble might have ended with scraped knees or worse, but as the boy watched, he instinctively reached. His arm did not travel fast, it moved like a dream, but the moment slowed around him. He caught his brother's sleeve before the fall could finish. Both of them stared, startled. His brother laughed first, the way children do when relief becomes too heavy for silence. The boy only smiled, though a question stirred quietly inside him. Why me? But questions like that were not meant to be answered in childhood. Instead, the boy lived each day with ordinary rhythms, touched now and then by the extraordinary. He chased after chickens in the yard, played in the river shallows, and fell asleep to the hum of his mother's voice. Yet within these simple days the stretches kept happening. Not always physical, sometimes emotional. When his father returned home tired from work, the boy would look at him with eyes that seemed to hold more patience than they should. It was as if he stretched the silence between them, giving his father space to breathe. When his mother grew weary, the boy would sit beside her quietly, and the moment of rest would last longer than usual. The family noticed. They did not speak of it openly, but they cherished it. The villagers, too, began to notice. A neighbor once commented, that the boy seemed able to make a moment linger. "When he smiles at you, it feels as though the smile doesn't end," she said, almost embarrassed by her own words. Others agreed, though none could explain it. They accepted the boy's strangeness as they accepted the slowing of clouds on certain afternoons, with curiosity softened by calm, yet not every stretch was perfect. There were times when he reached too far, and the moment snapped back with unease. Once he tried to grab a loaf of bread from the far end of the table. His arm lengthened clumsily, and the bread tumbled to the floor. Another time, he reached for a bird fluttering just out of grasp, and the bird darted away faster than his stretch could follow. The boy frowned then, realizing that his gift had limits. The world could be bent but not broken. His mother soothed him in those moments. "Not everything is meant to be caught," she whispered. "Some things are meant only to be reached for." The boy nodded, though he did not fully understand. Still, her words lingered, sinking into him like seeds that would bloom later. At night he dreamed of reaching for things that could not be touched, stars, echoes, even time itself. In those dreams his stretches were endless, spanning horizons. But in the morning, when sunlight warmed the wooden floorboards, he was again a boy with small hands and a family who loved him. As he grew, so too did his awareness of the quiet difference that set him apart. He noticed that his brother's steps were ordinary, while his own seemed to carry a pause. He noticed that laughter shared with him seemed to last longer, like a note held on the edge of song. At first he wondered if this was only his imagination, but when he saw others pause around him, waiting, listening, lingering, he began to believe still no one treated him as special. And perhaps that was the greatest gift. His father taught him chores without leniency. His mother scolded him when he tracked mud through the house. His brother wrestled him in the grass, pinning him down with laughter. His difference was not a crown upon his head, but a thread woven into ordinary life. Years later, when people spoke of his childhood, they remembered not the strangeness of his reach, but the warmth of his presence. They recalled a boy who lingered by the river, who listened with his whole body, who laughed like he was stretching joy itself. The stretches were real, yes, but what stayed with them was the feeling that he made moments softer, longer, kinder, and so even in his earliest years, he began to learn that stretching was not about distance or ability. It was about empathy. Each reach was an offering, a way of saying, "I see you, I am with you. I will hold this moment a little longer, so you do not have to let go too soon." The boy did not yet understand this fully, but the seeds were planted. One day those seeds would grow into something larger, carrying him toward people he had not yet met, toward lessons he had not yet learned. For now he was simply a child who reached too far, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, but always with a gentleness that the world, in its quiet wisdom, recognized and cherished, and under skies that still slowed for him, he kept reaching. Night had always been a tender time in the boy's home. By day the house echoed with footsteps, with the clatter of dishes and the laughter of children running in and out of doorways. But when darkness arrived, everything softened. The fire crackled lower, the air cooled, and voices became hushed as though they, too, had grown tired. It was in these hours that the boy's mother began to hum. No one knew when the humming started. Perhaps she had always done it, or perhaps it was something she began only after his birth. What mattered was not the melody's origin, but its effect. The lullaby carried no words, only sounds that rose and fell gently, like the breathing of someone sleeping peacefully. The tune drifted through the air as if it were a small boat rocking on a lake at night. The boy, still small enough to sleep in a wooden cradle by the window, would listen with his eyes half closed. He did not yet understand music, not in the way adults might. What he understood was feeling. Each hum seemed to say, "You are safe, you are loved, you are here." That was enough. His body relaxed, his tiny fingers curled around the edge of the blanket, and his breath slowed to match hers. Sometimes his father, sitting silently nearby, would close his eyes too, as if the lullaby was meant for him as well. His older brother often pretended to be asleep, but would lie very still, listening. The grandmother, who claimed never to believe in magic, admitted once that the humming reminded her of her own mother long ago. In this way, the lullaby stretched beyond the boy. It gathered everyone in its quiet arms. It was during one of these nights that the boy felt something unusual. As his mother hummed, He realized the tune was not only entering his ears but traveling deeper, weaving itself into his dreams. In sleep, he found himself standing in a meadow of tall grass that swayed in rhythm with the melody. The sky above was vast and gentle, filled with drifting clouds that seemed to hum back. The sound was not sharp or urgent. It was soft, endless, a kind of whisper that told him the world was listening. When he woke, the melody lingered, as if it had followed him from the dream. He looked up at his mother and for the first time hummed a note back. It was clumsy, just a sound a child might make, but his mother froze. She smiled, then bent down and pressed her forehead to his. "You heard me," she whispered. The boy did not understand her words, but he understood her heart. From that night forward, the lullaby became their shared language. Sometimes she sang it softly while working, and he would hum a broken version back. Sometimes when he was restless or upset, a single note from her was enough to calm him. The family grew so accustomed to the sound that they hardly noticed it anymore, like the steady flow of the river nearby. And yet deep down they knew it was shaping him. The lullaby did more than soothe. It taught him something about time. Each note seemed to stretch, holding itself longer than expected before falling away. It was as if the music itself had learned his gift. He began to realize that not every moment needed to rush forward. Some moments were meant to linger, to cradle the heart before letting go. As he grew a little older, he started creating his own small songs. They were simple, strings of humming stitched together clumsily, but when he sang them to himself, he felt the same calm settle over him. Once, when his brother scraped his knee and cried, the boy sat beside him and hummed. The melody was uneven, trembling, but his brother stopped crying long enough to listen. Later, the brother admitted that the pain had not gone away, but it had felt lighter, as though someone else had carried it for a while. The villagers, too, began to notice. On quiet evenings, when the windows of the boy's house were open, they would hear the mother's lullaby drifting through the village. Neighbors passing by slowed their steps, caught by the sound. Some hummed it unconsciously as they returned home, carrying it with them like a lantern in the dark. Over time, the melody became woven into the village itself. People hummed it while kneading dough, while rocking infants, while sitting alone in thought. The song belonged to everyone, but at its heart it belonged to the boy. There was one night, however, that stood apart. A storm had rolled in from the hills, heavy with rain and thunder. The wind rattled the shutters and the boy woke crying. He stretched his arms toward his mother, not only physically but in that strange way he often did, as if pulling her closer without moving at all. She gathered him quickly, holding him against her chest. The thunder growled again, and his small body trembled. She began to hum, louder this time, letting the sound rise above the storm. Each note was a shield, each pause a deep breath in the dark. Slowly, his sobs softened. He pressed his ear to her chest, listening not only to her song but to the steady beat beneath it. The thunder continued outside, but inside the room another world existed, a world held together by melody and love. By the time the storm passed, he was asleep again, still curled in her arms. Years later, when he was grown, he would remember that night not for the storm, but for the song that carried him through it. The memory would stay like a light in his chest, reminding him that even in moments of fear, softness could endure. As he drifted into early childhood, the lullaby became less of an event and more of a presence. It was there in his waking thoughts, in his dreams, even in the spaces between words. He found himself humming without realizing it, when stacking stones by the river or when watching the sky. Sometimes the melody sounded different, as though the song itself was stretching, changing, growing with him. But one truth remained constant. The lullaby was his anchor. It told him where he belonged. It reminded him that even when the world felt too large, too strange, there was a thread tying him back to love. He did not need to name it, for it was not a lesson to be spoken. It was something felt, like the warmth of sunlight or the hush of clouds that moved slowly overhead. And so, night after night, his mother hummed, and he listened. The lullaby became the backdrop of his childhood, a quiet star always shining. He would carry it forward, though he did not yet know how far it would reach. For now, it was enough that the song cradled him into sleep, and in that sleep the world seemed softer, kinder, as if it too were humming along. The boy's earliest memories were not of grand events, but of small ordinary moments that somehow carried more weight than they should have. Among them, one memory lingered most tenderly. A day in the meadow with his brother, eating sandwiches beneath the warm, forgiving sun. It was not a holiday, nor a celebration. It was simply a day when the air smelled of grass, and the world seemed willing to pause for them. His brother, older by a handful of years, had taken him by the hand and led him beyond the edges of the village, past the low stone wall and into the open field where wildflowers nodded lazily in the breeze. The sky above was wide and unbroken, its slow clouds drifting as though they had no destination. His brother carried a small cloth bundle, tied with care, and when they reached the hilltop, he spread it out on the grass. Inside were sandwiches, nothing more than bread with a bit of cheese and a smear of butter. But to the boy they seemed like a feast. His brother handed him one with a grin, and together they sat, cross-legged in the sunlight. The boy remembered the way the bread felt in his hands, soft and yielding, and the way the cheese clung just slightly to his teeth. It was not the food itself that mattered, but the way it seemed to stretch the moment, to make the world simpler. For those few minutes, there were no questions about gifts or strangeness, no whispers from villagers, no worries about storms or work. There was only bread, cheese, sunlight, and laughter. His brother told stories between bites, stories of heroes and animals, of rivers that carried secrets and stones that could sing. The boy listened with wide eyes, chewing slowly, as if each word needed to be tasted. Sometimes he laughed, not always because he understood, but because his brother's joy was contagious. And there, in the meadow, the boy discovered something, that time could be stretched not only by his reach, but by love. His brother's presence seemed to hold the world still, just as surely as his own gift sometimes did. Together, they created a space that was wider than either of them alone. The sun was warm on their shoulders, and the grass tickled their ankles. Bees hummed lazily nearby, weaving between flowers, but even they seemed slower here, as if caught in the same spell. The boy lay back, half-finished sandwich in hand, and stared at the sky. The clouds drifted like enormous sails, and he felt that if he reached just a little farther, he could touch them. His brother laughed at the sight of him stretching upward, but instead of teasing, he joined him, lying back with his arms spread wide. Together they reached for the sky, knowing they could never grasp it, and yet finding joy in the reaching. Later, when their sandwiches were gone, his brother pulled a blade of grass and began to whistle through it. The sound was uneven, high and thin, but it made them laugh so hard their stomachs ached. The boy tried to imitate him, failing at first but eventually producing a shaky note that made his brother cheer. It was the kind of moment so small it should have been forgotten, but instead it carved itself deep into the boy's memory, because it was not just a meal. It was belonging. It was the first time he felt that simple rituals, a bite of bread, a shared laugh, a slow afternoon, could stretch longer than they should. It was not magic in the way people might describe. It was softer than that, quieter, a kind of magic that lived in the spaces between breaths. As they lay in the meadow, his brother turned to him and said something the boy would never forget. "When we're together, it feels like the day never ends." The boy nodded, not fully understanding the weight of the words, but feeling them sink into him like sunlight sinking into the earth. That evening, when they returned home, their parents asked where they had gone. His brother shrugged and said only, "We ate sandwiches in the sunlight," and that was explanation enough. His mother smiled knowingly, as though she understood that something important had happened, even if it could not be put into words. Years later, the boy would recall that day whenever he thought of his brother. He would remember the softness of the bread, the sound of laughter carried on the wind, the way the sky seemed to bend a little closer to them. He would remember how time felt then, unhurried, forgiving, endless, and in moments of loneliness or doubt when the world seemed too heavy, he would return to that meadow in his mind. He would close his eyes and feel again the warmth of sunlight, the weight of a sandwich in his hand, the presence of his brother beside him. That memory would become a kind of lullaby, different from his mother's song, but carrying the same promise. You are safe, you are loved, you are here. Perhaps this was why sandwiches would always carry a quiet symbolism for him. They were never just food. They were rituals of connection, reminders of afternoons when love was simple and enough. In later years, when he made sandwiches for others, he would do so with care, as though he were recreating that meadow moment, offering not just bread and cheese but the gift of time itself. For now, though, he was still only a boy lying in the grass, crumbs on his shirt, staring at a sky that seemed within reach. His brother's laughter rang in his ears, and the sun warmed his skin. And though he could not name it, though he could not yet understand it, something inside him whispered, "This is how love stretches." And so the day lingered, soft and golden, the kind of day that does not end but folds itself into memory, ready to be unwrapped again and again whenever the heart needs it. The boy had always loved the river. It wound gently around the edge of the village like a silver ribbon, sometimes wide and slow, other times narrow and quick, but always alive with its own quiet song. He often wandered to its banks when he wanted space, when the air in the house felt too still, or when his thoughts pressed heavily on him. The water seemed to listen without judgment, carrying away whatever he whispered to it. One afternoon, when the boy was a little older, he followed the familiar path down through the grass and found someone already there. An old man sat on a flat stone near the bend where the current slowed. His back was slightly curved, his hair a pale scattering of white, and in his hand he held a smooth riverstone. Without a word, he flicked the stone across the water. It skipped once, twice, 3 times before sinking with a soft plop. The boy stopped at the edge of the clearing, uncertain. Strangers were rare in this part of the village. Yet there was something about the man that felt steady, not threatening. The boy sat on the ground a little distance away, knees drawn to his chest, and watched. After a long silence, the man turned his head and said, "Do you know what makes a stone skip?" The boy shook his head. "It listens," the man said simply. He picked up another stone, turned it over in his hand, then tossed it. Again it skipped, bouncing lightly across the surface before vanishing. A stone that listens knows how to touch the water without breaking it. That's the secret. The boy thought about this, though he did not fully understand. He picked up a stone of his own and tried. It fell with a heavy splash. He frowned, embarrassed, but the old man only chuckled. "Not every stone is ready," the man said, "and not every hand knows how to let go." The boy stayed with him that day, trying again and again. Most of his stones sank immediately. A few bounced once, clumsy, but enough to make his heart leap. Each failure felt softer when the man was there, patient and calm, never hurrying him. By the time the sun dipped low, the boy had managed 2 skips in a row. He laughed, surprised by his own success. The man smiled. "You'll learn. But remember, skipping isn't about throwing harder. It's about listening. To the stone, to the river, to yourself." Those words lingered, though the boy could not yet place their meaning. He felt as though the man was speaking of something larger than stones and water. The old man became a quiet presence in his days. The boy would return to the river, and more often than not the man was there sitting on the same stone, pockets full of pebbles smoothed by time. Sometimes they spoke, though often they did not. The boy found comfort in the silences, in the rhythm of stones skipping and sinking. Over time he began to notice something about the man's eyes. They were not sharp like those of the hunters, nor weary like the farmers. They were steady, deep, as though they carried the river within them. When the man looked at him, the boy felt truly seen, not as a curiosity, not as the child who stretches, but simply as himself. One evening, when the sky was painted in soft colors of dusk, the boy finally asked, "Why do you skip stones every day?" The man leaned on his knees and smiled faintly. "Because the river always changes, but the stones teach me patience. Each skip is a conversation. Some days the river answers kindly, some days it doesn't, but I still listen." The boy nodded slowly, storing the words like pebbles in his own pocket. It was during these afternoons that the boy began to understand his own gift in a new way. When he stretched toward a stone that had rolled too far, he found that the motion was easier if he listened first, to the shape of the moment, to the quiet of the river. It was not about forcing his reach, but about softening into it, letting it unfold. And when he skipped a stone successfully, he felt that same soft stretching inside himself, as though time had paused to smile. The man never asked about the boy's strangeness, though he surely noticed. Once, when the boy's arm lengthened farther than it should have, the man only said, "The river doesn't question its own flow. Neither should you." The boy carried those words home, turning them over in his mind. He began to see his gift less as something odd and more as something natural, like water running downhill or clouds drifting slowly overhead. Sometimes his brother joined them at the river. The old man would show him too how to choose flat stones and how to flick the wrist just right. Together, the three of them spent long hours by the water, their laughter echoing against the banks. The boy felt a growing bond with the man, not quite family, not quite stranger, but something in between, a mentor. Though he did not yet know the word, there came a day when the man handed the boy a particularly smooth stone, pale grey and perfectly round. "Keep this one," he said. "Not every stone is meant for skipping. Some are meant for holding." The boy turned the stone in his palm. It was cool at first, then warmed against his skin. He nodded, slipping it into his pocket where it clicked softly against his other treasures. A button, a feather, a piece of glass worn smooth by time. But the stone felt different. It felt alive, like a reminder waiting patiently. As he walked home that evening, the boy hummed his mother's lullaby, stone clutched tightly in his hand. The melody blended with the memory of the river's song, with the sound of the man's voice saying, "To stretch is to listen." He did not yet know why those words mattered so deeply, but he knew he would never forget them. And from then on, whenever he stretched, whether for a toy for his brother's hand, or simply for the sky, he tried to listen first. To the air, to the silence, to the hidden rhythm that seemed to hum beneath everything. Slowly, gently, he began to understand that his gift was not only about reaching farther, it was about reaching softer. The river kept flowing and the man kept skipping stones. The boy kept returning, learning without lessons, growing without realizing it. And in those quiet days by the water, a new bond formed, one that would carry him forward long after the stones had sunk and the river had moved on. It began quietly, the way a stream begins before anyone notices, just a trickle, soft and unassuming. The boy had always dreamed, of course, but now his dreams seemed to lean closer, as if they wished to speak to him. They did not shout, nor frighten, nor rush. They whispered, like the hush of wind through tall grass, carrying words that faded even as he tried to hold them. The first time he noticed, he was very young still. He had fallen asleep with the river stone in his hand, the gift from the old man. That night, his dream was not of wild adventures or running games, but of standing by the water under a sky both strange and familiar. The clouds moved slowly, slower than waking clouds, and the river hummed a tune he thought he almost recognized. Then came a voice, not loud but steady, as though it rose up from the water itself. "Stretch gently, not far. Listen first." He woke with the stone warm against his palm, the words lingering like mist. At breakfast, when his brother asked why he was staring at nothing, he only shrugged. How could he explain? It had felt real, but not in a way others would believe. From then on, the whispers returned now and again. Sometimes they came as fragments, an image, a feeling, a phrase that sank into him and echoed long after morning arrived. Other times they were softer still, like a lullaby sung from another room, half heard but undeniably there. He did not fear them. If anything, they comforted him, as though the world itself was leaning close to reassure him that he belonged. The whispers never demanded, never hurried him. They were like gentle hands guiding him towards something he could not yet see. One night he dreamed of his mother's lullaby, but it was sung not by her voice, but by the wind through tall reeds at the riverbank. The melody bent and shifted, yet he understood it. In the dream, the reeds swayed as though bowing toward him, their rhythm matching the rise and fall of his breath. When he awoke, the lullaby still lingered in his chest, as though he were carrying the dream forward into waking life. Another night, he dreamed of his brother. They were once again in the meadow, eating sandwiches, but the bread never grew smaller. Each bite stretched the moment, keeping them there, suspended in sunlight. His brother's laughter rang like bells, and though the boy knew it was only a dream, he also knew it was teaching him something, that joy itself could be stretched, savored, made to last longer than the moment that held it. As these whispers accumulated, the boy began to listen differently during the day. He found himself pausing before reaching for things, listening inwardly the way the old man had taught him to listen to stones and river currents. When someone in the village spoke in anger, he heard not just their words but the sorrow beneath them. When his brother laughed, He caught the tenderness hidden inside the sound. Even silence became something worth listening to, because sometimes silence spoke the loudest. Still, he did not tell anyone about the dreams, not even his brother. Some things, he felt, were meant to remain quiet, like secrets between him and the night sky. He carried them the way one carries a secret talisman, close to the heart, unseen but powerful. There was one dream, however, that he could never quite forget. It came on a winter's night, when the air outside the house was sharp and cold. He slept wrapped in a heavy blanket, the stone once again in his hand. The dream began in darkness, but then a faint light appeared, soft as the glow of fireflies. It grew into a sky full of stars, each one shimmering with a slow pulse as if breathing. The stars whispered, not in words exactly, but in feelings. The boy understood them nonetheless. You are not alone. The sky remembers you. He woke with tears on his cheeks, though he did not know why. Something in the dream had touched him too deeply for explanation. He pressed the stone to his chest and lay awake for a long time, listening to the stillness of the house, wondering if perhaps the stars were listening back. From that night onward, he began to notice the stars more. When he walked with his brother, he looked up. When he sat with the old man by the river, he gazed at the sky reflected in the water. The stars no longer felt distant. They felt like companions, silent but present, whispering in ways he could only half understand. And as he grew, he realized that his gift, the stretching, the reaching, was tied not only to his body but to these whispers. They taught him that stretching was not about distance, but about connection. To stretch was to notice, to pause, to allow himself to be touched by what was already near. One morning, when he told the old man that he sometimes felt the river spoke to him in his dreams, the man only nodded and said, "Of course it does. Rivers never stop speaking. Most people just forget how to listen." The boy felt a wave of relief. Perhaps he was not strange after all, or if he was, then strangeness was simply another kind of listening. In the years ahead, he would dream many more dreams. Some he would remember clearly, others only in fragments, but always they whispered. And always he listened. He never tried to chase them, never tried to force meaning from them. Instead, he let them settle inside him like rain sinking into soil. He trusted that they would bloom in their own time, perhaps years later, perhaps only in memory. For now it was enough to know that his dreams were not empty shadows. They were companions, guides, soft voices reminding him that every moment, waking or sleeping, was part of a greater song. And in that song his place was not uncertain. It was already waiting, already written in whispers. And so the boy slept peacefully night after night with his stone by his side and his dreams leaning close. The whispers carried him, softened him, stretched him gently across the threshold of night. And somewhere in that in-between place the world itself seemed to hum, "You are not alone. You are heard." He first noticed her in a moment so small it almost escaped memory. She was sitting at the edge of the village square, half hidden by the shadow of a low wall, her knees drawn to her chest. The day was loud, merchants calling out their wares, children running past with laughter trailing like ribbons, but she sat apart unmoved, as though the noise belonged to a world she had already stepped away from. Her eyes caught him before anything else. They were not dazzling, not brighter than stars, not sharper than glass. They were quiet. Deep in their stillness, he felt a reflection of something he already knew, like water that holds a sky without claiming it. She did not speak when he approached. She only looked at him, her gaze steady but not unkind, and then she lowered her eyes to the thread she was winding around her fingers. He sat near her, uncertain, expecting some word of greeting. None came. At first he thought her silence meant distance, but as the minutes stretched, he began to feel something different. Her quietness was not a wall. It was an invitation to share the silence, to let it grow around them like tall grass. He stayed, letting the noise of the square fade until it seemed far away. When he finally spoke, it was only to point at the thread she wound around her hand. "Doesn't it hurt?" he asked softly. She looked at him again, a faint curve at the corner of her mouth. Then she shook her head. That was all, no words. But he understood her answer as clearly as if she had spoken aloud. From that day forward, they found each other often, not by arrangement, but by some quiet gravity. At the riverbank, in the meadow, in the spaces where others gathered and she sat apart. She rarely spoke, and he never pressed her to. It felt enough to sit side by side, to let their silence become a kind of language. He began to notice small details about her, the way she touched leaves as she walked, as though asking their permission. The way her breath slowed whenever she listened to the wind. The way her eyes softened when she looked at animals or children, as if she carried a secret tenderness too wide for words. In her presence, he felt no need to prove himself. His strange gift, his stretching, did not matter to her. Once, when his arm reached a little farther than it should have, she simply blinked, then returned her gaze to the clouds. No questions, no fear, no astonishment. It was as if she had already seen things stranger than him, or as if she accepted him entirely without needing explanation. He began to think of her silence not as emptiness, but as fullness, like a cup of water so still that it reflects the entire sky. He found himself listening more deeply when she was near, as though her quietness reminded him that the world itself was whispering. One evening, as twilight painted the village in shades of violet, he and his brother walked past the square and saw her sitting there again. His brother whispered, "Why don't you ever ask her name?" The boy shrugged. Somehow it felt unnecessary. A name would have been too small, too sharp, for the soft presence she carried. To him she was not a word to be spoken, but a feeling to be remembered. Still, in the privacy of his own mind, he began to think of her as the girl with quiet eyes. As days turned into weeks, their silences grew richer. They learned to speak without speaking. The tilt of her head meant she was listening. The slow blink of her eyes meant she was amused. The faintest curve of her lips meant she was glad. He found himself offering small gestures in return, sharing a piece of bread without words, pointing out the shape of a cloud, humming softly the lullaby his mother used to sing. And sometimes, when their silences grew heavy with meaning, he felt something stir inside him, a kind of stretching that was not of body or time, but of heart. Her quietness invited him to open, to reach inward, to discover tenderness he had not known was there. One afternoon they sat by the river together. The old mentor was not there that day, and the water moved lazily, catching light in ripples. The boy picked up a stone, weighed it, and skipped it across the surface. It bounced twice before sinking. He glanced at her. She reached for a stone of her own. Her throw was clumsy, but the stone managed a single skip before vanishing. She looked at him, and for the first time she laughed, not loudly but softly, like water brushing against rocks. It was the first sound he had heard from her, and it filled him with a warmth deeper than the sun on his skin. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled in his chest. Instead, he laughed too, and their laughter mingled with the river's song, carrying gently into the evening air. From that day, her silence felt even more alive. He realized that silence could hold laughter, just as it could hold sorrow or comfort. Silence, like his gift, could stretch, and when it stretched between them, it became a thread tying their hearts in ways that words might have broken. The bond between them grew, not through conversations, but through presence. Sometimes they walked without destination, watching clouds drift. Sometimes they shared food in the meadow, the act itself more important than the taste. Sometimes they simply sat, breathing in rhythm, as though two instruments playing the same song. He began to understand her the way he understood his mother's lullaby, not through words, but through something deeper. He didn't always understand her silences, but he understood her heart. And that was enough. Years later, he would look back and realize that she had taught him something profound, that not every connection is made of speech, and not every bond requires explanation. Some are woven from glances, pauses, shared spaces, and the quiet trust of simply being together. For now he carried her presence like a secret gift. The girl with quiet eyes had entered his life like a soft note in a lullaby, barely heard, but impossible to forget. And though he could not yet name it, he knew her silence had begun to change him. And so the chapter of his life stretched into new silence, filled with laughter that needed no words, with companionship that asked nothing but presence. And beneath the quiet, something in him whispered, "This is what it means to be seen." The boy did not notice at first how his gift began to change with him. It had always been something physical, his hand stretching farther than it should, his arm reaching for things beyond his grasp. But slowly, almost without his realizing, it became something else. It became a way of listening. It started with small things, One morning as he passed through the square, he noticed a girl no older than himself tugging at her coat, the fabric torn and frayed at the sleeve. She looked down, embarrassed, as though the whole world could see her need. The boy felt something stir inside him, a tug not in his muscles but in his chest. He knelt, touched the fabric softly and said, "I can fix it." She looked at him with surprise, then nodded silently. He stretched, not his arm this time, but his patience, taking careful stitches with thread borrowed from his mother's basket. The mending was uneven, clumsy, but the girl's face lit with quiet relief. He realized then that to stretch was not always to reach farther. Sometimes it was to stay longer, to give more of himself than was required. He began to notice other moments too. A boy sitting alone after a game, shoulders slumped. An old woman carrying more firewood than she could manage. His own brother, pretending to be strong when the weight of chores wore him down. In each moment, the boy found that if he paused, if he listened not just to words but to the silence around them, he could hear what people truly needed. Sometimes it was help. Sometimes it was presence. Sometimes it was nothing more than kindness left unspoken. The girl with quiet eyes seemed to understand this without explanation. Often, she was there beside him when these small acts unfolded. She never praised him, never questioned him. She simply watched, her silence deep as always, and in her gaze he felt understood. It was as though she too was listening to the hidden music of people's hearts. One afternoon, he and his brother were walking home when they came across a farmer sitting on the side of the road, his face in his hands. The man's cart had broken, and the wheel lay heavy in the dust. His brother looked uncertain, shifting from foot to foot, ready to keep walking. But the boy knelt beside the farmer, touched his arm and said gently, "It's hard, isn't it?" The farmer lifted his head, startled. No one had said such words before. Most would have offered advice or silence or laughter. But the boy's words were not solutions. They were a mirror. The farmer nodded, and though the cart was still broken, something in his shoulders eased. Later, as they continued home, his brother asked, "Why did you say that?" "You didn't fix his cart," the boy thought for a long moment. Because maybe he didn't need the cart fixed first. Maybe he just needed someone to see him. His brother didn't answer, but he glanced at the boy with a new kind of respect, one that made the boy feel taller inside. That night as he lay in bed, he remembered the old man's words by the river, "To stretch is to listen." He began to understand them more clearly now. Listening was not simply about hearing words. It was about hearing the spaces between them, the quiet truths people carried but could not always speak. Even the whispers in his dreams seemed to guide him this way. Sometimes they came as fragments, "Be still." Not farther, but closer. "Wait and see." And though they faded with the morning light, they left behind a tenderness in him, like footprints pressed into soft earth. The girl with quiet eyes became his companion in this listening. They sat together in silence so often that he began to recognize the layers of it. Silence that was heavy, silence that was calm, silence that was full of laughter waiting to spill. She had taught him that words were not always the deepest way to understand someone. Presence was its own kind of language. One evening, as the sky turned orange and the first stars pricked through, he asked her softly, "Why don't you speak much?" She turned to him, her quiet eyes steady, and after a long pause she said only, "Because listening is enough." Her words, so rare and simple, stayed with him long after. Listening is enough. He repeated it like a lullaby as he drifted to sleep that night, feeling it settle in him like a stone in still water. From then on, he made it his practice to listen, not only to people, but to the world itself. He listened to the rustle of leaves, to the way clouds seemed to shift when they passed overhead, to the rhythm of footsteps on the road. He discovered that the world was always speaking, if only he slowed enough to hear it. He did not think of himself as a hero. He did not even think of himself as different. He thought only that his gift had given him a new way of seeing. And each time he reached for someone, not with his arms, but with his attention, he felt the quiet satisfaction of stretching into something larger than himself. As the seasons turned, the boy carried these lessons like small treasures: a mended coat, a farmer's softened shoulders, his brother's unspoken gratitude, the girl's rare words. Each moment added to his understanding that life was not about great acts or loud declarations. It was about small kindnesses, stretched gently across time, so that they lasted longer than the moment itself. And in the hush of night, when the whispers returned in his dreams, he no longer wondered what they wanted from him. He only listened. And listening, he realized, was already enough. The boy had always watched the sky. From the day of his strange birth, when the clouds drifted slower than they should have, something in him had been drawn to their endless wandering. He liked how they seemed to move without urgency, how they shifted shape yet never lost themselves. One afternoon, lying in the meadow with his brother, he noticed something peculiar. The clouds overhead seemed to tilt just slightly, as if leaning toward him. At first he thought it was a trick of the eyes, but as he stretched his arm into the air, the shapes seemed to gather more closely, their edges softening into curves that mirrored his reach. "Do you see that?" he whispered. His brother squinted. "See what?" "The clouds, they're listening." His brother laughed and shook his head. "Clouds don't listen. They're just clouds," but the boy was not so sure. For as long as he could remember, he had felt a quiet bond with the sky. And now, as he lay with his head in the grass, he felt certain. The clouds were not only drifting, they were remembering him. In the days that followed, he began to test this quiet suspicion. When he walked alone by the river, he would pause and tilt his face upward. More often than not, a cloud seemed to linger above him, moving slower than the rest. When he sat in silence with the girl with quiet eyes, he would glance up and notice patterns. 2 clouds side by side, echoing their own stillness. Even in his dreams, clouds appeared, whispering softly as though they carried stories too vast for words. It was never dramatic. Never lightning or thunder, never storms breaking open. Only gentleness, a bending, a remembering. He told the old man by the river once shyly, as though afraid of sounding foolish, "I think the clouds know me." The man skipped a stone and nodded. "Of course they do. The sky remembers everything. It just doesn't tell most people." The boy smiled at this answer. It felt true in a way that needed no proof. The clouds became a motif in his life, appearing at unexpected moments. When he mended a coat, he noticed a white puff hovering low, almost protective. When he comforted his brother after a long day's labor, the evening sky glowed with streaks of rose-colored clouds, as though blessing the moment. When he sat with the girl and said nothing, the clouds seemed to echo their silence, drifting softly in pairs. Once, he stretched his arm farther than ever before, reaching toward a drifting wisp above him. For a breath, it seemed to lower itself toward his fingers, as though answering his reach. He laughed, a quiet sound, not because he touched it, he never could, but because it felt like the sky was trying too. The girl with quiet eyes noticed. She did not ask questions. She simply looked up with him, her gaze steady. And in that gaze he felt confirmation. Yes, the clouds were listening. He began to think of them as keepers of memory. When people laughed in the square, the clouds drifted slower, carrying the echo. When people wept, the sky grew heavy, holding their sorrow until it could no longer bear the weight. And when he stretched his gift, whether in body or in heart, he felt the sky bend gently as though acknowledging his effort. Sometimes at night, he wondered if the clouds carried his dreams too. He imagined them floating across the world, filled with whispers, spilling soft messages into the ears of strangers far away. Perhaps that was why his dreams sometimes felt like voices not his own, because they had traveled on the back of clouds. His brother remained unconvinced. "You imagine too much," he said one evening as they lay on their backs watching the sky. "Maybe," the boy admitted, "but even if it's only imagination, doesn't it still matter?" His brother considered this, then grinned. "I suppose so. Imagination is its own kind of stretching." The boy held on to that thought. It was true, the clouds did not need to prove themselves. It was enough that he felt their presence, that they carried something of him, something of everyone. One day, as he walked alone through the meadow, he stopped beneath a cluster of low, gray clouds. The air was cool, heavy with the promise of rain. He tilted his face upward, and for a moment he thought he heard something. Not a word, but a hum deep and low, like a lullaby sung from above. It lasted only a breath, then dissolved into the breeze. But it was enough to leave him standing still, heart slowed. Feeling both small and infinite, he whispered back, softly, "I remember you too." The clouds moved on, slow and certain, as though carrying his words into eternity. From then on, Whenever he looked at the sky, he did so with reverence. The clouds were not just weather. They were memory itself, soft, shifting, forgiving. They carried laughter, sorrow, silence, and song. And somehow, impossibly, they carried him too. And so the boy lived with this quiet knowing that above him always drifted reminders of who he was and who he might become. Clouds that remembered, clouds that listened, clouds that stretched across the sky the way he stretched across time and love. It happened one evening when the light was fading and the air felt thick with the hush of day turning to night. The boy and his older brother were walking home together, their hands brushing now and then as siblings' hands sometimes do, half by accident, half by instinct. The world was golden, drenched in the long shadows of dusk, and even the crickets seemed hesitant to begin their nightly chorus. They came to a hill, steep and lined with loose stones. His brother, always the bolder one, raced ahead. The boy followed slower, watching the way his brother's laughter tumbled down the slope before him. For a while it was nothing but play, the kind of simple joy that belongs only to children, where even a stumble feels like part of the game. But then, in the way such moments do, everything shifted. His brother's foot caught against a jagged rock. He pitched forward, his arms flailing, the ground rushing up to meet him. The laughter broke into a cry, sharp and surprised, a sound that carved through the soft air. Time should have kept running, should have carried his brother into the fall. But in that instant, the boy felt something deep inside him stir, a warmth, a pulling, as if the thread of the world itself had tangled in his chest. He reached out, not only with his hand but with all that he was, his care, his fear, his love, and the world listened. The fall slowed. The stones no longer rushed. His brother's body seemed to float, suspended in the gentlest of descents. The air thickened, stretched like a long breath held between heartbeats. The boy could hear his own pulse, heavy and slow, like the beating of a distant drum. He stepped forward, steady and calm, and caught his brother's arm before it met the earth. Together, they eased down to the grass as though the world itself had bent to soften the moment. For a while neither of them spoke. His brother stared wide-eyed, his breath ragged. The boy's hand still trembled, though he did not let go. Around them, the twilight deepened, and the clouds above lingered as though holding their breath too. Finally, his brother whispered, What just happened?" The boy shook his head. "I don't know, I just didn't want you to fall." There were no better words for it. He had not commanded the world, had not forced it to obey. He had only stretched his love outward, as far as it could reach. And somehow, impossibly, the world had stretched with him. His brother touched his arm, tentative but firm. "You saved me." The boy looked down, embarrassed, his cheeks warm. "Maybe I only slowed it. Maybe you would have been fine," but in his heart he knew. This was no ordinary stumble. Without that moment of slowing, his brother would have been hurt badly. And it was not strength that had changed the outcome, not muscles or speed. It was something gentler, something rooted in love. That night, as they lay in their shared room, the boy listened to his brother's breathing drift into sleep. He stared at the ceiling, replaying the fall in his mind, and wondered at the strange truth of it. Time itself could bend when the heart asked softly enough. He did not tell his mother. He did not tell the girl with quiet eyes. He carried the memory like a secret folded inside him, fragile and glowing. Only his brother knew, and even he seemed unsure whether it had truly happened. But the boy knew. He could still feel the way the air had thickened, the way love had stretched wider than fear. Days passed and the world moved on, yet he found himself looking differently at time. Sometimes in the meadow, he would close his eyes and breathe slowly, wondering if he could lengthen the moment just by being present. And sometimes, when sitting with someone in sorrow, he would feel the minutes expand, as though grief itself could be given more room to breathe. It was never dramatic. He did not stop storms or rewrite destiny. But here and there, in small, tender ways, he felt time soften around him. A conversation with his mentor would last longer than it should have, stretched by listening. A smile from the girl with quiet eyes would linger in his chest, echoing beyond its moment. Even a shared sandwich with his brother seemed to belong to eternity. It was never dramatic. He did not stop storms or rewrite destiny. But here and there, in small, tender ways, he felt time soften around him. A conversation with his mentor would last longer than it should have, stretched by listening. A smile from the girl with quiet eyes would linger in his chest, echoing beyond its moment. Even a shared sandwich with his brother seemed to belong to eternity. The memory became a quiet anchor, a reminder that strength was not in force, but in softness, not in rushing, but in slowing. And as the boy grew, he carried it like a hidden stone in his pocket, smooth and certain, guiding him forward. For the rest of his life, he would never forget that first moment when time itself listened, when love stretched and the world stretched back. The old man still came to the river, though his steps were slower now. Where once his stride had carried the ease of someone who knew the stones beneath his feet, it now carried hesitation, each movement careful, deliberate, as if testing the earth for steadiness. His hands, once quick to skip stones across the current, trembled as they reached for the flat pebbles that lined the bank. The boy, older now but still learning, walked beside him. He had grown taller, his arms longer, his gift of stretching more subtle, woven into the way he listened and lingered with people. Yet in the presence of his mentor, he felt as small as he had the first day they met. Together they sat near the water's edge. The river moved as it always had, slow in some places, quick in others, a constant song of shifting depths. The old man held a stone in his palm, weighing it with the concentration of someone remembering muscle memory, rather than relying on it. He flicked it across the surface, and though the stone bounced only twice before sinking, he smiled as if it had danced a dozen times. To stretch, he said, his voice softer than before, is to listen. I told you that once. The boy nodded. I remember. And do you hear it now? The man tilted his head toward the water. The river still speaks. The boy closed his eyes, letting the rhythm of the current fill him. It was not a voice in words, not something to be translated. It was a sound that carried patience, persistence, and change all at once. The river had always been moving, long before either of them existed, and it would go on moving long after. I hear it, the boy whispered. The man leaned back against the grass, his breath slow. Good, because the river teaches in ways the sky cannot. The sky remembers, yes, but the river shows you how to let go. They sat in silence after that, the only sound the water and the occasional bird. The boy wanted to ask more, but something in the old man's stillness held him back. Sometimes listening meant not interrupting. When the man spoke again, his voice was thinner, yet filled with the same quiet wisdom. When you stretch time, you are not changing the river's course. You are stepping into it differently. You let one moment ripple longer, like a stone skipping, but the current carries on. Always it carries on. The boy thought of his brother's fall, of how love had slowed the world around them. He thought of the clouds that seemed to lean toward him, the girl with quiet eyes who shared silence without demand. He thought of his mother's lullaby, how its hum seemed to echo long after the song had ended. Yes, the river was right. Everything carried on, yet each stretch was like a ripple widening across memory. The old man tried another stone, his hand trembling more this time. The stone slipped before it left his fingers and plunked into the water with no bounce at all. He chuckled softly. Even that has something to teach. Not every throw skips. Some just sink, and that is its own kind of lesson. The boy smiled, though his chest ached with something he could not name. He had begun to notice the frailty in his mentor's body, the slowness of his steps, the length of his pauses between words, the deeper lines around his eyes. Time stretched for them here, but not forever, so he stretched his presence instead. He leaned closer, listened longer, offered his strength in small, unspoken ways, an arm when the man rose. Their silence that carried respect. Evenings grew cooler as the season shifted, but still they returned to the river. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they simply watched the water. The boy found that these quiet hours mattered more than any lesson spoken aloud. The river itself seemed to teach them both, that life was not a rush to reach the sea, but a series of ripples, each precious in its slowing. One evening, the man rested without picking up a stone. He folded his hands together and watched the current. There will come a day not long from now when I will not walk here. The boy swallowed, his throat tight. Don't say that, the man smiled faintly. It is no sadness, only truth. Rivers change, so do we. What matters is how we listen before we go. They sat until the stars appeared, the river glinting with their reflections. The boy thought about how time felt in moments like this. Not rushing forward, not standing still, but stretching into something gentle, endless, and deeply human. When he finally helped the old man rise, he held his arm a little longer than necessary. The man did not mind. In fact, he leaned into it, as though to say this too is part of the lesson. To let someone stretch for you. To let yourself be carried for a moment. And so the river taught again, not with words or stones, but with silence, with letting go, with the long tenderness of two lives meeting in the flow of time. There came a season when the boy no longer tried so hard to reach. He had spent years testing the edges of his strange gift, stretching arms, stretching moments, stretching even his heart into places others could not see. Yet one afternoon, while sitting alone in the meadow where the clouds leaned toward him, he discovered something new. Sometimes, to stretch was not to move at all. He had been lying in the grass, the sun soft upon his face, listening to the hush of the wind combing through the tall stalks. His body felt heavy, not with weariness but with peace, the kind of heaviness that anchors you to the earth. He did not reach. He did not strain. He simply breathed. And as he breathed, he felt the moment lengthen. Not like pulling taffy, not like stretching an arm across a table, but like water spreading slowly across stone. The quiet itself seemed to expand, filling every corner of him. Minutes passed, though they did not feel like minutes. They felt like one unbroken exhale, a stillness that carried him further than any motion could. He thought of his mentor's words, still echoing after so many riverside evenings. The river shows you how to let go. Now in the meadow he understood more clearly. To let go was not only to release grief or to surrender control. It was to rest in the present so completely that time itself softened. That night he tried again. He sat at the edge of his bed, closed his eyes, and allowed the quiet to arrive. He did not push thoughts away nor chase them. He simply let them come and go like clouds drifting, and as he did, he felt the room lengthen around him. The silence grew vast, as though he were sitting inside a stretched lullaby. He did not fall asleep right away, but when sleep came, it came gently, like a hand guiding him into dream. In the days that followed, he began to practice this stillness as though it were its own art. When his brother grew restless, he would sit nearby without speaking, simply offering presence. When the girl with quiet eyes came to visit, they sometimes shared entire hours without words, only the comfort of stillness between them. Even she, who seldom spoke, seemed to notice the difference. She would tilt her head slightly, her gaze soft, and he knew she understood. Sometimes silence said more than sound. The boy also discovered that this gift of stillness stretched beyond people. Animals, too, seemed to sense it. A bird once landed near his knee and lingered, unafraid. A rabbit crept close enough to nibble at grass within arm's reach. Even the clouds, his old companions, appeared to drift more lazily when he practiced being still, as if they too felt the invitation to slow. He began to realize, to be still is to listen with the whole body. It is to offer the world your undivided presence, a stretch that requires no movement, only devotion. One evening, his brother grew frustrated while mending a tool. The boy approached, ready to help, but instead of reaching for the broken handle, he simply sat nearby. He breathed quietly, patient and steady. At first his brother muttered, annoyed by the stubborn wood. But after a while his movement slowed, his shoulders eased, and he finished the task with calm hands. When he looked up, the boy was still there, smiling softly. "You didn't do anything," his brother said. "Maybe not," the boy replied. "Or maybe stillness does its own kind of work," the brother laughed, shaking his head. But he could not deny the peace that had settled in the room. The boy thought often of his mother's lullaby. It had never been the words he remembered. He still could not recall them clearly. What he remembered was the way the sound stretched into the night, the way it made his small body feel safe enough to drift into sleep. That too, he realized, had been a form of stillness, his mother's steady humming, her presence wrapping around him like a blanket. Perhaps the greatest gift she had given him was not the song itself, but the way she lingered beside him, unhurried. The more he practiced, the more he saw how the world responded. Grief softened in stillness. Joy lingered longer when not rushed. Even pain became bearable when given the space to breathe without resistance. Stillness stretched every part of life, not by changing it, but by allowing it to unfold gently without demand. One late afternoon, he returned to the river. He carried no stones, for his mentor no longer came to skip them. Instead, he sat and listened. The river's song was as endless as ever, but now he heard something new. Not urgency, not even movement, but a stillness at its core. Beneath every ripple and splash, there was a steady hum, a heartbeat of water that never wavered. He sat until the sun fell behind the trees, until the sky turned lavender, and the first star appeared. He said nothing, stretched nothing, reached for nothing. Yet he felt himself expand, wide as the sky, deep as the river, held by the gift of stillness itself. When he rose at last, he carried the silence with him, like a lantern glowing quietly in his chest. And he knew as he walked back to the world that stillness was not emptiness. It was fullness. It was love, stretched so wide it no longer needed to move at all. The year unfolded like a slow song. It was not a season marked by sudden change, nor by grand events. Instead, it was made of small, quiet moments, the kind that might have gone unnoticed, if not for the boy's gift of listening. His brother had grown taller, stronger, carrying himself with the restless energy of youth. There were days when his laughter filled the fields, chasing birds and sunlight. There were other days when frustration carved itself across his brow, when the weight of chores and expectations made him mutter beneath his breath. The boy stayed near through it all. He had learned the value of stillness, of presence, and so he stretched his heart across those days, offering patience without pressure. One evening they shared bread at the table. His brother tore his piece with unnecessary force, chewing hard as though trying to bite through his worries. The boy did not comment. He only sat, chewed slowly, and let the silence soften the air between them. After a while his brother sighed and looked at him with tired eyes. "I don't know how you do it," he said. "Do what?" the boy asked. "Stay so calm. Everything feels heavy and you just—" "Carry it different." The boy smiled faintly. "I don't carry it. I let it stretch." His brother frowned, then laughed quietly. "You and your strange words." Yet beneath the laugh, there was gratitude, a subtle bond formed not by explanation, but by shared time. The girl with quiet eyes remained a presence in his life, like a melody that never needed to raise its voice. She came often, sometimes with no reason, sitting beside him beneath the trees or walking with him along the riverbank. They rarely spoke much, but their silences were filled with meaning. A glance from her was a sentence. The brush of her sleeve against his was a poem. One day as they sat together, she picked a small flower and handed it to him. She did not smile, but her eyes lingered on his face and he understood. This was not just a flower. It was a wordless thank you, for all the times he had stretched his presence toward her. He tucked the flower into the pages of a book, where it would remain long after its petals dried. The bond between them grew like that, quiet, unhurried, a season stretched by companionship. It was not love as songs describe it, not fiery or loud. It was a softer love, made of patience and recognition, two souls who found comfort in the same silences. The mentor, too, remained in his life, though the boy saw how time pressed upon him more each day. The old man's steps faltered often, and his breath came slower, yet he insisted on visiting the river whenever he could. The boy walked with him, lending an arm when needed, never rushing him. Together they sat at the water's edge, speaking less and less, for the mentor's voice had grown thin. One afternoon the man placed a trembling hand on the boy's arm. "You listen well," he said. "Better than I ever taught you. That is how bonds grow, not by reaching for more, but by staying long enough for the other to unfold." The boy felt his throat ache, but he only nodded. He had learned that sometimes answering was not necessary. The silence itself was the answer. And so his days became a tapestry of these three connections: the restless brother who leaned unknowingly on his calm, the quiet-eyed friend whose silence sang like music, and the mentor whose fading presence still taught more than words could hold. Each bond carried its own rhythm, yet together they wove the season into something sacred. He noticed how small gestures mattered most. The way his brother left him the last slice of bread without comment. The way the girl brushed dust from his sleeve unasked. The way his mentor pressed a stone into his hand, saying nothing, just letting the weight speak for itself. The boy began to understand that love was not always in grand declarations. It was in sandwiches shared in the sun, in stones passed from one hand to another, in silences that held more comfort than words. One evening, He found himself walking home beneath a sky that shimmered with slow-moving clouds. He thought of each bond, his brother, his friend, his mentor, and felt the world stretch within him. These were not fleeting connections. They were threads in the fabric of his being, woven deep enough that even time could not unmake them. He paused on the path, tilting his face upward. The clouds drifted lazily, and he felt them remembering again. He whispered softly, as though to the sky itself, "Hold them with me. Let these bonds stretch farther than I can," and the sky has always listened. The season passed like this, not with fireworks or storms, but with the quiet beauty of relationships deepened by presence. The boy carried it all gently, like a lantern in his chest, each bond glowing with its own light. He knew the days would change, that nothing stayed forever. But for now, in this long and tender season, he stretched into the fullness of connection and let it hold him. The day was slipping into its softer half when the boy decided to walk. The sun had lowered itself gently, leaving the fields washed in amber light, as though the world were exhaling after a long breath. Shadows stretched across the path, thin and tender, like threads unspooled from the earth. He did not carry anything with him, no stones, no bread, no words waiting to be spoken. Only himself, only his footsteps, and the hush that falls when day leans into night. The first part of the walk carried him past the meadow where he and his brother had once eaten sandwiches in the sun. He could almost taste the bread again, soft and warm, though years had passed since that afternoon. He smiled at the memory, not because it was extraordinary, but because it had been simple, and the simple things had stretched the farthest. Further along, he came to the grove where the girl with quiet eyes often sat with him. Tonight she was not there, yet her absence was not emptiness. It was a presence of its own, like a note in a song that lingers even after the sound has faded. He paused beneath the trees, listening for her silence, and felt the hush settle into him like a gift. The path wound toward the river. The air cooled as he drew near, the scent of water rising like a gentle reminder. He found the place where he and his mentor used to sit, the stones smoothed by years of waiting. The old man no longer walked this far, but his voice still lived here. The boy could hear it in memory, speaking slowly, letting each word skip across time like stones across the current. To stretch is to listen. To let go is its own kind of reaching. The boy sat for a while, breathing in the river's endless murmur. The current glinted with the last of the light, as if carrying fragments of the day downstream to somewhere unseen. He thought of his mentor's frailty, of the way he leaned now upon others, and the boy understood. One day, too, he would lean, and one day he would be carried. Stillness and listening were not just lessons for youth. They were lessons for life. When he rose again, the sky had deepened into a blue that felt almost endless. The first stars glimmered faintly above, shy at first but growing bolder as the horizon darkened. He remembered lying on the hill with his brother, watching the clouds tilt toward him. He remembered the slow fall he had softened with love, the way time itself had listened in that moment. He thought of how bonds, brother, friend, mentor, were not things to hold tightly but to walk with gently as the evening walked with him now. He began to hum, quietly at first, then with more certainty. The tune was his mother's lullaby, the one that had stretched across his childhood nights. He still did not know the words, but he did not need them. The hum was enough, carrying both memory and comfort. The sound floated into the dusk, mingling with the crickets, with the river's murmur, with the rustle of leaves, and as he hummed, the walk itself seemed to stretch. Each step lingered longer than it should have. Each breath widened into something more than breath. Time slowed, not in the way it had when danger loomed, but in a softer way, a way that felt like gratitude. He passed through fields where fireflies had begun to appear, tiny lanterns bobbing in the air. They flickered like stars scattered close enough to touch, and he wondered if the sky had lowered itself just for him tonight. Perhaps the clouds had whispered to the stars, telling them to come closer, to keep him company on his long walk. He reached the edge of the village but did not go inside. Instead, he turned back toward the horizon, where the last thread of sunlight bled into the sky. He stood there for a long time, feeling the quiet press of everything he loved, the warmth of his brother's laughter, the calm of the girl's gaze, the steady presence of his mentor, the lullaby of his mother. All of it wrapped around him like dusk itself, soft and encompassing. The boy understood then that walking was not always about reaching a place. Sometimes walking was simply a way to carry memory through the world, step by step, until memory itself felt alive. This walk at dusk was not a journey outward but inward, air stretching into himself. When he finally turned homeward, the stars had thickened and the sky was velvet dark. His hum faded into silence, but the lullaby lingered in his chest. He carried it with him as surely as he carried the bonds of those he loved, and so the long walk at dusk became part of him, a memory not of distance traveled, but of time stretched into belonging. It was in the late afternoon, when shadows leaned long and the air was soft with the smell of grass, that he noticed the child, a little figure at the edge of the path, sitting quietly, tracing lines in the dirt with a stick. The boy, though he was no longer a boy but not yet fully a man, paused as if time itself had asked him to wait. The child did not look up at first. Only when a bird startled nearby, wings flashing in the low sun, did the small face turn. Eyes wide and wondering met his. There was no fear, only a kind of quiet recognition, as though the child had been waiting. He approached slowly, careful not to break the fragile air of the moment. "Are you alone?" he asked softly, his voice as calm as the river at dusk. The child nodded, then shook their head, as children often do when words are too heavy for truth. And then it happened. The small hand reached out. Not with urgency, not with demand, just a simple offering, a gesture that said without words, "Walk with me." He looked at the hand for a long moment. It was tiny compared to his own, fragile and yet filled with its own kind of strength, the strength of trust. Slowly, reverently, he took it, their fingers curled together, not tightly, but with a softness that spoke louder than any promise. The path felt different when walked with a child's hand in his. Steps slowed. The world seemed to bend lower, closer, as though to meet the child's gaze. Grass bent more gently. Stones seemed less sharp. Even the air carried a lighter weight. They walked together toward the meadow, where fireflies had begun to appear. The child pointed at them with delight, the other hand tugging gently at his own, urging him to notice what he already knew, that the world was made of tiny wonders, and that wonder could stretch endlessly if you allowed it. As they walked, he remembered his brother's laughter in this same meadow, the sandwiches they had eaten under the sun. He remembered the quiet-eyed girls' silences that spoke louder than words, and his mentor's stones skipping across water. Now this child's hand wove those memories into something new, a continuation, a bridge from past to present. The child hummed as they walked, a soft, tuneless murmur, as though inventing a melody on the spot. Something about it reminded him of his mother's lullaby. He found himself humming along, their two voices weaving together in the dusk, carrying memory forward like a lantern. When they reached the riverbank, the child bent to pick up a stone. The small hand struggled to lift one that was too heavy, and without thinking he reached down and helped. Together they carried it to the water's edge, and together they let it go. The splash was small, but the ripples widened far across the surface, carrying with them the simple truth that some things are best shared. The child looked up at him then, eyes shining in the twilight. No words were spoken, but the meaning was clear. "You are someone I can lean on." And in that gaze he felt something awaken. Not the stretching of limbs, not the slowing of time, but the stirring of a deeper tenderness, an instinct to protect, to guide, to hold steady. He realized that strength was not in how far he could reach, but in how gently he could carry another. They lingered by the river until the stars began to bloom overhead. When it was time to return, the child's hand found his again, without hesitation. The path home felt softer beneath their feet, as though even the earth approved of the bond forming between them. As they reached the edge of the village, the child finally spoke, a voice so small it was almost a whisper. "Will you walk with me again?" He did not answer with words. Instead, he squeezed the little hand, a stretch of silence that meant yes, and so, in the quiet glow of starlight, he carried this new bond with him, tender and bright, a reminder that sometimes the greatest journeys begin with a single, fragile hand in one's own. There are rituals that stay with us, not because they are grand, but because they are gentle. For him, the making of sandwiches became one of those rituals. He remembered the meadow of his childhood, the warm bread, the sunlight pressing softly on his skin. He remembered his brother beside him, laughing between bites as if the world were as simple as bread and sky. That memory lingered like a lullaby without words, and now, years later, he found himself carrying it forward, not for himself but for others. One afternoon he woke with the thought that the day was meant for sharing. The village was hushed with the slow rhythm of summer, and the air carried the smell of grass and faint wildflowers. He rose, gathered what he could: bread, cheese, small greens, a jar of honey. Nothing fancy, nothing rare, just the kind of food that softened hunger and made people pause. He laid the bread out carefully, as though arranging something sacred. Each slice felt like a thread connecting past to present, and he found himself smiling as he spread honey across the surface. He remembered how the sun had glistened on the meadow that day long ago, and for a moment it felt as if sunlight itself had seeped into the bread now in his hands. The child was the first to arrive. Small fingers tugged gently at his sleeve, eyes widening at the sight of the sandwiches. He offered one with a kind of reverence, and the child accepted it with both hands as though it were more than food. Watching the child bite into it, crumbs scattering, he felt something loosen inside him. The memory had become present, alive again, not locked in the past. Soon others gathered. His brother, older now, came with a quiet smile, sitting beside him on the grass. The quiet-eyed girl lingered at the edge before settling down, her silence folding into the group like another voice. Even his mentor, frail and slower these days, found his way to the meadow, leaning on a carved stick but determined to sit with them. They ate together as the sky stretched above them, the afternoon ripening into a soft gold. No words were needed, though some were spoken. His brother joked lightly. The child hummed while chewing, inventing a song between bites. The mentor spoke only once, his voice slow but sure. Food made with memory fills more than the body. The quiet-eyed girl said nothing, but her gaze rested on him with the weight of understanding. He thought then about how food carried memory, how the act of making something simple could become a thread binding lives. The bread was more than bread, the honey more than sweetness. It was his childhood, stretched gently into the present. It was his way of giving back what he had once been given. As the sun shifted lower, the meadow filled with a calm light, and the air grew softer. He lay back on the grass, hands folded behind his head, and watched the clouds drift slowly. They seemed to tilt toward him again, as if recognizing the ritual, as if remembering too. The child lay down beside him, small hand reaching for his without asking. His brother stretched out on the other side, and soon the others followed, all of them gazing upward, bellies full, hearts quiet. The sky grew deeper, the first hints of evening coloring its edges. For a while the only sound was breathing, the quiet rhythm of belonging. He realized that this was what it meant to stretch, not to reach far, not to hold tightly, but to create spaces where others could rest. The child turned to him and whispered, "It tastes like sunlight." The words were small, imperfect, but they carried the truth of it. He nodded, smiling, knowing the child had felt the same warmth he once had in that first meadow. When it was time to leave, they rose slowly, as if reluctant to disturb the moment. The meadow remained behind them, but the memory walked with them, folded gently into their steps. That night, lying awake, he thought of the sandwiches. Simple food, yet heavy with meaning. He thought of his mother's lullaby, of his mentor's stones, of his brother's laughter, of the girl's silence, of the child's trusting hand. All of it, stretched into bread and honey, into the act of sharing. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. The ritual would return again, he knew. Sandwiches were not just food. They were memory. They were love turned into something you could hold, something you could taste, something you could pass along. And so, the meadow remained alive within him, carried forward each time he laid bread on the table, each time he handed food into waiting hands. The past had become the present a seed of memory yet to come, and in that quiet circle he felt at peace. The night was quiet when it happened, too quiet, as though the world had hushed itself in preparation for something unusual. He lay on his mat beneath an open window, listening to the rhythm of crickets, the slow exhale of the wind, the faint whisper of leaves. His body was still, but his mind drifted gently toward sleep, carrying with it the hum of memories, sandwiches in sunlight, a child's hand in his own, the hush of the river. Sleep took him softly, like a tide pulling a small boat from shore. At first the dream was familiar. He stood in a meadow where clouds moved as slowly as they had on the day of his birth. The grass was tall, the air golden. His brother was laughing somewhere nearby, though the sound was faint, like an echo carried from far away. He stretched his hand, and the dream stretched too. The grass leaned longer, the horizon tilted outward, and the sound of laughter grew closer. Encouraged, he reached further, not just his arm but his awareness, his sense of time itself. The meadow swelled larger than life, and suddenly the world inside the dream seemed without edge. At first it felt wondrous. Stars bent low, fireflies flickered like constellations within reach, and every sound was stretched into song. He felt as though he could walk forever, as though nothing could escape the length of his touch. But then he noticed something unsettling. The farther he stretched, the thinner everything became. Colors dulled. Sounds wavered. His brother's laughter, once warm, now sounded strained, as though pulled too far from its source. Even the grass beneath his feet felt fragile, like fabric stretched close to tearing. He tried to stop, to release the dream back to its natural shape, but it resisted. His own gift had tangled itself into the fabric of sleep, and now he was caught inside. He felt his limbs heavy, his chest tight, as though the very air were reluctant to let him breathe. "Come back," a voice whispered. It was not loud, not urgent, but steady. He turned and saw the child standing in the distance, holding a small stone in their hands. The child's presence was sharp against the dream's blur, like an anchor refusing to stretch. He tried to step toward them, but the ground gave way, bending and folding like cloth beneath water. He stretched again instinctively, but this time it pulled him further away. He felt himself drifting from the center of who he was, stretched thin across too many moments at once. The child dropped the stone into the dream river, and the ripples reached him. Each ripple carried weight, a reminder of gravity, of limits, of stillness. He focused on the circles widening outward, and slowly he began to gather himself back. He pulled his reach inward, step by careful step, until the meadow softened into clarity again. The child reached out their hand. He took it, and suddenly the tension snapped. The dream collapsed gently, folding back into itself like paper closing, and he was left standing in the quiet center of it all. When he woke, his breath came uneven, his body damp with sweat. The night outside was unchanged, crickets, wind, leaves, but inside him something had shifted. He lay still, staring at the dark ceiling, and realized he had touched the edge of his gift. Stretching could go too far. Even tenderness could unravel if pulled without care. He turned on his side, clutching the blanket as though it were the child's hand. He thought of the ripples on the water, of the way the stone had anchored him back. He understood now that dreams, like people, needed space to be themselves. To stretch was not to possess. To stretch was not to consume. It was only ever to listen, to touch gently, to extend love without breaking what was fragile. His heart slowed, breath deepening, and he whispered into the night, "Enough is enough." The words soothed him, a boundary folded into sound. For the first time, he felt the strength not only of reaching, but of knowing when to stop. And with that he drifted again into sleep, this time letting the dream hold its own shape, while he simply rested within it. It began with a restlessness in the evening. The sky was dimming, painted in long strokes of lavender and fading gold, and though the world outside was easing itself into calm, he could not. His hands lingered uselessly on the table, his thoughts circling like moths around a flame that would not go out. He thought of her, the girl with quiet eyes, the one who rarely spoke, yet whose silences had always said enough. Their time together had been stitched from pauses, from gazes held a little longer than most, from the weight of shared air between them. And now, with her absence stretching across days and months, he felt that silence grow louder, wider until it pressed against his chest. So he reached for a sheet of paper. It was rough, unremarkable paper, folded in the corner of a drawer, waiting for some purpose. He smoothed it flat, dipped his pen in ink, and began to write. The first words came haltingly. "I do not know if you'll ever read this." He paused, hearing the scratch of the pen echo too loudly in the room. Still, he pressed on. He wrote about the meadow, about the day when fireflies had gathered around them like scattered stars. He wrote about the lullabies he sometimes hummed, and how he wondered if she had ever carried those quiet tunes with her into sleep. He wrote about the sandwiches, about the child's hand, about the river and the mentor's stones. Each word felt like a stretch of thought across the silence between them. But even as he wrote, he sensed the truth. Words could never fully hold her presence. Her quiet had always spoken more than any ink could. Still, he wrote, as though the act itself was a way of listening to his own heart. At times his sentences wandered, circling around truths too delicate to name. He wrote I don't always understand your silences, but I think they understand me. And then he stopped, staring at the line until the ink dried darker, as though the words themselves were nodding in agreement. Outside, night thickened. Crickets began their chorus, and the first stars blinked awake. He wrote by lamplight now, shadows stretching long across the table. His hand grew tired, but his thoughts kept flowing softer, slower, until the letter was filled with fragments, half poems, half memories, half dreams. When he reached the bottom of the page, he set the pen down and read what he had written. It was not perfect. It was not even clear. But it was honest. The letter carried his voice as if it were a lullaby, uneven, imperfect, but true. He folded the paper carefully, pressing the creases flat with both palms. For a moment he imagined walking to her door, placing it gently in her hand, and seeing those quiet eyes lift to meet his. He imagined her reading, perhaps smiling faintly, perhaps saying nothing at all, but then the truth settled in him, calm and steady. Some words are not meant to be sent. Some words are meant only to be written, so the heart can hear itself. The silence between them was already whole. To force words into it might break what was fragile and sacred. So he tucked the letter into the drawer, sliding it gently between sheets of paper. It rested there, unseen yet alive. He did not burn it, nor discard it. He simply let it wait, like a stone placed by the river, held, remembered, but not thrown. He blew out the lamp and sat in darkness, listening to the quiet house. The night seemed to breathe with him, as if approving his choice. Sometimes stretching was not reaching outward at all. Sometimes it was holding still, allowing space to remain untouched, lying down. He closed his eyes and thought of her silence, not an absence, but a presence that stretched across distance, wrapping gently around him even now. He whispered into the dark, though no one was there to hear, "I hope you're at peace." And with that, he drifted into sleep, the unsent letter resting quietly in the drawer, carrying words that would live only in his own heart. The river had always been their place. From the first time he'd seen the old man bending down to choose a smooth stone, to the many afternoons they had sat together in silence, listening to water speak its endless language. The boy, now older yet still carrying that softness of youth, had learned more from those stones than from any book. Each one carried a lesson, each skip across the surface a kind of quiet wisdom. But the mentor had grown frail. His steps, once steady and unhurried, were now uncertain, leaning heavily on a carved stick. His eyes still held their calm light, but his body had begun to drift towards stillness, like a leaf carried slowly downstream. On a late afternoon, golden with the heavy hush of summer's end, the boy accompanied him to the river. They moved slowly, each step a small victory. When they reached the bank, the old man sank onto a flat rock, breathing with the rhythm of one who has lived many seasons and has nothing left to chase. For a long time they said nothing. The boy picked up a stone and turned it over in his palm, feeling its smooth surface. He thought of the words his mentor had once spoken. To stretch is to listen. He understood them more deeply now than ever. He had learned that listening was not only with ears, but with the whole self, with patience, with presence, with love. Finally, the old man spoke. His voice was thin but steady, a thread that carried across the years. "You have stretched far, child, farther than I ever could, and yet you have not broken. That is rare." The boy lowered his gaze, humbled by the words. "I only learned what you showed me." The mentor smiled faintly. "I only showed you stones. You turned them into rivers. They sat until the sun began to dip, painting the water with orange fire." The old man reached into the folds of his robe and drew out a single stone. It was small, unremarkable to the eye, rounded, grey, plain. But the way he held it, with both hands cradling it gently, made it seem more precious than any jewel. "This," the mentor said softly, "is the last stone I will give you. I have no strength left to throw it. That part is yours now. But know this, every stone carries not just the thrower's hand, but the time spent holding it. The weight of waiting, the warmth of touch. That is its true journey. The boy took the stone reverently, feeling its coolness in his palm. He wanted to speak, to promise something, but his throat ached with unshed words. Instead, he simply nodded, understanding that silence itself was sometimes the most faithful response. The old man sighed then, a sound both weary and content. "When I am gone, sit here still. Hold the stone, listen to the river. You will hear me there." That night, the mentor's breath grew shallower. The boy sat by his side, watching, listening, his heart stretching painfully but gently. Just before dawn, as the first faint light touched the window, the old man exhaled once more and did not draw another breath. His face was peaceful, as though he had merely leaned into the river of sleep and let it carry him away. The village mourned quietly, as was their way. No loud cries, no grand ceremony. Only soft gatherings, shared stories, the hush of respect. The boy kept the stone close, never leaving it behind. He did not throw it. He was not ready. Instead, he carried it in his pocket, touched it when he needed steadiness, and let its weight remind him of the hands that had once held his own. Days later, he returned alone to the river. The air was cool, the water restless with morning light. He sat on the same flat rock where his mentor had last rested, and held the stone in both hands. The river murmured on, unchanged, eternal. He thought of all the lessons, of the way the old man had taught without commanding, spoken without pressing, guided without forcing. He thought of the stones they had thrown together, each one skipping outward in circles that never quite ended. He thought of how love, like ripples, carried on long after its source was gone. Tears came slow and steady, but not bitter. They felt like the river itself, flowing, cleansing, inevitable. He let them fall, and with them he whispered, "Thank you." He did not throw the stone. Not yet. Perhaps one day he would. Perhaps one day, when the moment stretched just right, he would let it skip across the water, carrying with it not just memory, but love. For now he only held it, letting the weight anchor him, letting the silence speak. And so the mentor's last stone became part of him, not as a burden, but as a legacy. A reminder that to stretch is to listen, and to listen is to love. Nights came differently after the mentor was gone. The boy, though he was no longer just a boy, found himself looking upward more often, as though the sky itself might carry the wisdom that had once sat beside him by the river. The days felt longer, stretched in ways he did not always welcome. Tasks filled the hours, conversations flowed around him, but in quiet pauses his hand would reach into his pocket, fingers brushing the smooth roundness of the stone. Its weight was steady, yet its meaning seemed to grow heavier each time he touched it. He wondered if that was what memory did, expanded in silence, echoing through the soul until it filled spaces never noticed before. One evening, after the village had gone still, and the air carried the scent of distant rain, he climbed a small hill beyond the fields. It was not far, but the walk felt like a journey, each step a release from the day's small burdens. By the time he reached the top, the sky had opened wide above him, a vastness spangled with stars. He lay down in the grass, his hands folded over his chest, the stone resting lightly in his palm. The earth was cool beneath him, the air soft against his skin. He let his breathing slow, long and measured, until his body felt as though it too were part of the night. The stars shimmered, countless and unhurried. Some burned steady, some flickered as if in conversation. He watched them the way one listens to an old friend, patiently, tenderly, with the quiet certainty that meaning would arrive not in words, but in presence. And then, without effort, he felt it, a stretch, not of his limbs, but of his being, as though the stars themselves leaned toward him, recognizing him, remembering him. Their light seemed to travel across impossible distances, just to rest on his face, just to whisper into the quiet places of his heart. He closed his eyes, but the sense did not fade. It deepened. He could almost hear the mentor's voice, not in words, but in the soft hum of existence. Every stone carries the hand that held it. Every star carries the gaze that loved it. The boy breathed in slowly, and as he did, he imagined that each breath stretched upward into the sky, weaving itself among the stars. He pictured the ripples of his life, small acts of kindness, the lullabies of his mother, the laughter of his brother, the quiet companionship of a friend who spoke mostly with her eyes, all of it drifting into the heavens, echoing softly in the spaces between constellations. A deep calm washed over him, not the absence of sorrow, but the presence of something larger, something that held sorrow gently within it. He thought of the river, how it carried stones without judgment. He thought of the stars carrying memory without end. And he felt, for the first time since the mentor's passing, that grief was not only loss, it was also connection, stretched beyond the boundaries of time. A breeze brushed across the grass, cool and steady, and he opened his eyes again. The stars had shifted slightly, as they always did, but he imagined them watching him as faithfully as he watched them. Each one seemed a soft echo, shimmering with remembrance, as if the universe itself had stretched to hold his mentor's spirit. His family's love, his friend's quiet bond. He whispered into the night, not sure who he was speaking to, or if words were even needed. "I am still here," he said softly, "and I feel you." The stars seemed to shimmer brighter at that moment, though perhaps it was only the moisture in his eyes. He let the tears fall without resistance, knowing they were not only grief but gratitude. Gratitude for having been taught to stretch, to listen, to love. Time passed strangely as he lay there. The hilltop seemed suspended between worlds, the earth beneath him and the sky above him blending together into a single vastness. He felt small but not insignificant. He felt like a note in a lullaby, soft and fleeting, yet necessary for the song to be whole. At last, when the air grew cooler and the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, he sat up slowly. The stone was still in his hand, cool but steady, patient as always. He turned it over once, twice, and then pressed it to his heart. Looking up one final time before returning to the village, he let the stars imprint themselves on his memory. Not as distant fires, but as soft echoes, reminders that nothing loved is ever truly gone, only stretched into another form, another place, another light. With that thought, he rose and walked back down the hill, each step slow, steady, and full of quiet reverence. The stars faded behind him, but their echoes stayed within, glowing softly like embers that would never burn out. Children notice things that adults often overlook. They see how a hand pauses before setting down a stone, how eyes soften when gazing at the sky, how silence itself can be a kind of answer. The boy, who was now becoming a man, though he carried the gentleness of his earlier years, did not realize how much the child beside him was watching, listening, learning. It had begun in small ways. The child would walk a little closer to him during the mornings, reaching out without speaking, letting their fingers brush against his sleeve as though to anchor themselves. Sometimes they would sit near him while he mended small things for neighbors, a torn coat, a broken toy, the frayed edge of a basket. The child did not ask questions, but their eyes followed every movement, wide with quiet wonder. One evening, as twilight painted the village in shades of violet and gold, he found himself walking with the child through the meadow, where he once ate sandwiches with his brother. The grass swayed gently in the breeze, and the sky stretched endlessly above them. He felt a quiet nostalgia, a looping of memory. Here was a place of beginnings, now carrying new meaning. The child tugged at his hand, and together they sat on the grass. Fireflies had just begun to glow, their lights flickering like whispers between stars. The boy smiled, remembering how he once thought the world itself was stretching to make room for him. Now he wondered if it was still stretching. But for the child beside him. And then softly, unexpectedly, the child began to hum. The tune was simple, a string of notes rising and falling with the rhythm of breath. At first, he thought it was nothing more than a child's wandering melody, but then the sound brushed against his memory, like a familiar scent drifting from long ago. His breath caught, his chest tightened. It was the lullaby. The same one his mother had sung to him on nights when the clouds drifted slowly across the sky. The same one that had carried him into dreams, that had anchored him when words could not. He turned to the child, eyes wide, heart trembling. "Where did you hear that?" he whispered, though his voice was softer than the night around them. The child only shrugged as though the tune had simply risen out of the grass and entered their mouth. "I don't know," they said. "It just came." He felt tears gather in his eyes, unbidden but gentle. He closed them, listening, letting the lullaby wrap around him like it once had. It was not perfect. The child's voice wavered, the notes slipped, But that imperfection made it even more tender, more human. It was as though the song itself had stretched through time, carrying love from his mother into this new voice. When the child finished, silence settled around them. Not an empty silence, but one full of presence, the kind of silence his mentor once said was the truest form of listening. He placed a hand on the child's shoulder, steady, warm. "That song," he said softly, "was sung to me when I was your age. It has been waiting for you." The child's eyes lit with quiet wonder. "Waiting for me?" "Yes," he said, smiling through the ache in his chest. "Songs have journeys too. They travel through hearts. They rest for a while, then find new voices when the time is right." The child seemed to think about this, their small fingers curling into the grass. Then they began humming again, even softer this time, as though they understood the sacredness of the sound. He closed his eyes and let himself drift with it, feeling the melody echo through his bones, through his memories, through every stretched moment of his life. That night, long after the child had gone home, he sat by the river holding the mentor's stone in his hand. The lullaby still rang within him, soft and insistent. He thought of his mother's voice, the warmth of her arms, the way her song had been a lantern in the dark. He thought of how the same melody had somehow found its way into another life, another generation without ever being taught. The stars reflected in the river, shimmering as though they too had been listening. He hummed the lullaby once quietly, letting it blend with the water's song. It felt less like singing and more like remembering. He realized then that legacy was not always carried in words or stones. Sometimes it was carried in songs that resurfaced unexpectedly, as if memory itself had decided to bloom once more. Sometimes it was carried in children who did not even know they were holding it, and with that thought his grief eased, if only a little. For the first time since his mentor's passing, he felt the stretch of life continuing not only within him, but beyond him, into the child, into the song, into the stars. The lullaby had become more than an anchor. It had become a bridge. Some goodbyes arrive loudly, full of tears and declarations. Others arrive quietly, like the turning of a season. This one came in silence, the kind of silence that wrapped itself around him and his quiet-eyed friend, as though the air itself knew what was happening. He had sensed it for weeks. The friends' visits grew less frequent, their walks slower, their pauses longer. When they sat together on the edge of the meadow, the friend's gaze seemed to reach past the horizon, searching for something that could not be found nearby. There was no need to ask. He felt it in his chest, the way one feels the change in weather before the clouds appear. Departure was near. On the morning it came, the sky was soft and grey, clouds drifting lazily as though reluctant to move on. The village was hushed as if holding its breath. The boy, though years now layered upon him, found himself standing beside his friend at the edge of the path that wound away from the river, away from everything familiar. They did not speak. Speech had never been their truest bond. From the beginning, their friendship had been shaped by silence, the quiet walks, the unspoken understanding, the gentle language of presence. Words would have felt clumsy now, too small to hold what they carried between them. He looked at his friend's eyes, still quiet, still holding that calm depth he had trusted so many times. Eyes that had spoken comfort without sound, eyes that had reminded him of still water reflecting the sky. They met his gaze steadily, a conversation without syllables. In those few moments, everything they had shared seemed to stretch between them like an invisible thread. The afternoons of companionship, the laughter that rose unexpectedly like birds startled from grass, the steady presence in grief and in joy. He thought of the sandwiches they once shared in the sunlight, of how silence had been enough. He thought of the lullabies that lingered like distant stars, of the mentor's stone still resting in his pocket. All of it wove itself into this moment, this farewell that did not require words. The friend lifted a hand, not to wave, but simply to rest it gently against his shoulder. A touch light and steady, a farewell written in warmth rather than sound. He felt the weight of it in his heart more than on his skin. It said, "I was here. You were here. That is enough." He wanted to speak, to say thank you, to promise that he would remember, but the words dissolved before reaching his lips. He realized then that silence was the truest gift he could offer in return, the shared language they had always understood best. And so he only nodded, slowly, reverently. A bow of the head, an acknowledgement, a final act of listening. The friend turned, stepping onto the path. Their figure moved steadily, growing smaller against the landscape, until only the curve of their shoulder was visible, then the outline of their head, then nothing but the path itself stretching toward the horizon. He stood for a long time, the imprint of that hand still warm on his shoulder, the silence still deep around him. He felt grief, yes, but not in the sharp way of loss. It was gentler, softer, like a lullaby fading into the distance. It did not break him. Fate stretched him. Later, as twilight settled, he walked to the river. He sat on the same flat rock, where he had once listened to his mentor, where he had held the stone and whispered thanks. The water moved endlessly before him, carrying leaves and reflections alike. He thought of how his friend's silence was like this river, always flowing, always present, even when unseen. He let himself close his eyes and listen. Not for words, not for voices, but for presence itself. And in that listening, he felt his friend still beside him, not in body, but in memory, in silence, in the thread that had stretched too far to be broken. The clouds overhead drifted slowly, bending toward him as they always seemed to. He imagined they carried whispers, fragments of the farewell that had never been spoken aloud. He imagined the stars above preparing to echo the same truth, that love once shared does not vanish. It becomes part of the quiet sky, part of the endless river, part of the silence we carry forward. When he rose to leave, the stone pressed steady against his palm. He felt lighter, though nothing had been explained. The farewell had been given, received, and carried. That was enough. The river had always been a place of return. Whenever his heart grew heavy, whenever silence pressed too sharply against him, he found his way back to its edge. It did not matter the season. The river flowed in spring with its bright rush, in summer with its lazy murmur, in autumn with its golden hush, and in winter with its steady patience beneath frost. No matter how he changed, the water kept its song. On this day he came alone. His mentor's stone still rested in his pocket, smooth and weighty as it always had. His quiet-eyed friend had gone, leaving behind only silence that lingered like a shadow of presence. The child had sung the lullaby and gone home to sleep. And so it was just him, the river and the sky above. The clouds drifted slowly, unusually slowly, as if they too carried the weight of memory. He watched them, and felt the years stretch across their shapes. The boy who once reached too far, the brother laughing with a sandwich in hand, the old man bending to choose a stone, the friend whose silence spoke volumes, the child humming a song older than their voice. All of it was there, painted faintly in the shifting sky. He sat on the flat rock where so many moments had gathered before him. His hands rested on his knees, palms open, as though ready to receive whatever the day might place in them. The river's murmur filled his ears, steady and patient. He let his breathing match its rhythm in and out, until the tension in his chest softened. Above him the clouds seemed to bend, one stretched thin like an outstretched hand, another curled softly, like the fold of a lullaby's last note. He smiled faintly at their unspoken language. He had long since stopped asking if such things were real or imagined. Real or not, the clouds remembered him, and he remembered them. That was enough. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the stone. It was cool to the touch, but not cold. He rolled it slowly in his palm, letting its smoothness remind him of afternoons spent learning from a mentor who taught not with lessons, but with presence. He whispered, almost without meaning to, "I still hear you." The river gave no reply, only carried on with its endless flow. But the clouds shifted again, parting to let a beam of sunlight fall across the water. It glimmered there like a gentle affirmation. He thought of his mother's lullaby still echoing through the child's voice. He thought of his brother's laughter, still alive in the meadow where fireflies danced. He thought of his friend's eyes, quiet and steadfast, speaking volumes in silence. All of them felt near, not as ghosts, but as memories alive within him. The river held them. The sky held them. He held them. Tears welled, but they were soft, like dew forming on grass. He did not resist them. He let them fall, small droplets joining the larger flow. As they touched the water, he imagined they carried his gratitude. Thank you for the lullabies. Thank you for the stones. Thank you for the silences. Thank you for the love. The clouds shifted again, this time forming a shape that reminded him of an open door, wide and welcoming. He breathed deeply, as if stepping through it in spirit, entering a place where memory and presence blended together. Time passed gently. The day leaned toward evening, shadows lengthening, the river growing darker yet no less alive. He stayed until the first star appeared, shimmering faintly above the horizon. He thought of how the stars had stretched toward him once, shimmering with memory. Perhaps they would again tonight. Before leaving, he placed the stone back in his pocket and pressed his palm against it firmly, sealing the moment. He whispered once more, "I carry you with me." Then he rose, his body slow but steady, and walked back toward the village. Behind him, the river continued its endless song, and the clouds drifted on, slow, remembering, soft as whispers in the sky. He had learned many kinds of stretching in his life. As a child, it was limbs, arms reaching farther than they should, legs bending with curious grace. As he grew, it became time. Moments lengthened, falls slowed, silences deepened. And later still it had been listening, stretching himself into others' hearts, into their grief and joy, into their quiet spaces where words could not go. But now, sitting alone in the quiet of evening, he discovered a new kind of stretch. It was not of body, nor of time, nor even of presence. It was memory itself, unfolding gently inside him, stretching wide enough to hold an entire life. The stone rested in his palm as always, cool and certain. He closed his eyes and let his breathing soften. With each breath, memories rose like clouds drifting across the sky. He stretched himself toward them, not to change them, not to seize them, but simply to hold them tenderly, as though they were fireflies glowing in the dusk. He saw his mother's face bent close to his crib, her voice carrying the lullaby that had traveled farther than either of them could have known. He felt again the warmth of sandwiches eaten in the meadow, his brother's laughter carrying through the sunlight like a bell. He stretched into those moments, not to relive them, but to lengthen them, to let them live a little longer in the soft glow of remembrance. He saw his mentor by the river, choosing stones with steady hands, teaching without instruction. He heard once more the quiet voice saying, "To stretch is to listen." He held on to that memory until it became more than just words. It became a way of being, echoing in every silence he had kept, every kindness he had offered. He stretched toward his quiet-eyed friend, remembering the long walks, the shared silences, the farewell given without words. He held that final look, the hand resting lightly on his shoulder, and let it lengthen within him until it filled the space of an entire evening. A farewell that stretched into presence even after absence. He stretched toward the child's voice, humming the lullaby as though it had bloomed directly from the soil of memory. That soft, wavering tune still echoed in his chest, proof that love carried itself forward in ways unseen, waiting for new voices to carry it on. Each memory stretched outward, one into the next, forming a tapestry that felt larger than his life alone. And in holding them, he realized that memory was not about clinging. It was about softening, allowing the heart to expand wide enough that nothing was left behind. The evening deepened into night, and he lay back on the grass, eyes open to the sky. The stars had begun to appear, faint at first, then brighter, each one shimmering like an echo. He stretched his memory into them too. His mother, his brother, his mentor, his friend, the child, all of them seemed written there, not as constellations but as quiet glimmers, flickering with love. He breathed slowly, his body still, his mind drifting gently between past and present. It felt less like remembering and more like weaving. He was stitching the fragments of his life together, stretching the thread until it circled back upon itself. Nothing was gone. Nothing was wasted. Everything was here, gathered, luminous. For a long time he simply lay there, letting memory stretch and stretch, until it no longer felt like the past but like an endless present, a single long moment holding every other. And then he whispered into the night, as softly as one whispers to a child already half asleep, "Thank you, all of you. I carry you and you carry me," the river murmured in the distance. The stars shimmered overhead. The clouds drifted slowly, bending as if to listen. He felt the universe itself stretching with him, wide enough to hold every love, every song, every silence, and in that stretching he felt whole. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like a blessing. The river whispered in the distance. The meadow lay still and the sky opened itself wide above him. He had walked here slowly, as though each step were a farewell, though not a sorrowful one. It was a walk of gratitude, of release, of presence. He settled onto the same flat rock where he had once sat with his mentor, where he had listened to the silence of his friend, where he had held the lullaby in his chest. The stone the mentor gave him rested in his hand, steady and familiar, as though it had been waiting for this moment. Above, the stars shimmered. They seemed closer now, leaning toward him, as though they had been watching all along, waiting for him to notice how near they truly were. He breathed deeply, his chest rising and falling in rhythm with the night, and let his eyes rest upon them. Memories drifted through him gently, one by one, but no longer as separate threads. Now they wove together seamlessly. His mother's lullaby, his brother's laughter, his mentor's wisdom, his friend's silent farewell, the child's tender voice. Each memory folded into the next, stretching until they became a single endless moment. He realized then that this was the longest stretch of all. Not arms, not time, not memory alone, but everything together, his entire being opening outward, reaching into the fabric of existence. He felt himself stretch toward the stars, and felt the stars stretch back toward him. The stone warmed in his palm, though the night air was cool. He smiled softly at the thought that it carried not just the hand of his mentor, but his own and perhaps one day another's. Stones, like songs, like silences, traveled farther than anyone could know. The wind brushed against his face, carrying with it the scent of grass, of river, of earth cooling beneath the night. He closed his eyes and let it wash through him. A final lullaby sung not by one voice but by the whole world. For a moment, he thought he heard whispers, not urgent, not loud, but soft echoes rising all around him. His mother's hum, his brother's cheer, his mentor's calm tone, his friend's steady gaze, the child's humming song. All of them speaking not in words but in presence, weaving themselves into the night sky. He breathed out slowly, a long and gentle exhale, and with it he felt himself expand, dissolve, drift. The boundaries between his body and the sky grew thin. The stars shimmered more brightly, as though making room for him. He stretched into them, not away from life but deeper into it, into the endless quiet that held everything he had ever loved. The last thought he carried was not of loss, but of gratitude. Gratitude for every sandwich shared in sunlight, every stone skipped across the river, every silence filled with meaning, every lullaby that lingered. Gratitude for the way the world had stretched to make room for him, and how he had stretched to make room for others. And then he was there, among the stars. Not burning, not vanishing, but shimmering softly, an echo of kindness, a ripple of love, a quiet presence woven into the night. Somewhere below, the river continued to flow. The clouds drifted slowly, as they always did. The child might hum the lullaby again. The friend might look at the horizon and remember. The world would carry on, and he would be part of it, stretched into something endless. And if anyone looked up at the night sky and lingered long enough in silence, they might feel it too, the soft shimmer, the gentle echo, the quiet love stretching back toward them. And with that he stretched into the stars.